All right, so good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world, and we are particularly excited because this week, all week long, we are celebrating World Oceans Week, leading up to Saturday's World Oceans Day. So we're having 25 plus hangouts with amazing ocean educators, scientists, researchers, and facilities from around the globe. So thanks for taking part in our grandest sort of festival every single year. All right, we've got 3 classes joining us from across North America right now. Want to give them a chance to do a bit of a shout out. We've got Miss Hearn Smith's grade 4 in Stratford, Ontario. Hi, guys. Awesome. We've got Miss Drake and Mr. Senior's grade 6s in Courtenay, BC. Hi, guys. See, Dr. Halliday, isn't this better than a scientific conference? So much more fun.
So much more enthusiasm.
Yes. And then Miss Oster's class just joined us from Thompson in Manitoba. Hi, guys. Your mic is muted, but your enthusiasm is noted, hopefully. All right, the reason you guys are all here today is for our speaker. So we are joined live by Dr. William Halliday. He is a conservation scientist with Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada. He lives and works in Victoria, BC, but also spends his time in the Western Canadian Arctic, trying to understand a little bit more of the cacophony of creatures up there and how they communicate, what they do, from seals to whales and more. We're going to dive right in and let Dr. Halliday share a little bit about the amazing work that he does. Thanks so much for joining us, William, and take it away.
All right, thank you, Jesse, and thank you everyone for joining me. I'm going to share my screen. See if I do it right.
I believe in you.
Okay. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep, I got your main slide and your slide deck to the left. I'll let you know. There you go. Perfect.
All right. Well, let's just get right into it then. So today I'm going to talk to you about underwater noise, and specifically underwater noise in the Arctic, which is the area that I research. And hopefully it gives you a bit of an idea about this pretty important and emerging issue. It's a global issue, but it's got particular importance in the Arctic. So let's just dive in. So first of all, let's start off with the boring stuff. Let's go with a dictionary definition. What is noise? So it's a sound that interferes with someone's hearing, or it's an unwanted signal or disturbance, or it's also a sound that lacks agreeable musical quality, or it's noticeably unpleasant. Now, I put up 3 different definitions because they all kind of come from a different perspective. The last one is clearly about music. And the first one has to do with you as the listener. When you're trying to hear someone, you're trying to listen to someone talk, and then there's something in the background. Maybe there's a loud roadway right beside you. You can hear cars going by, or there's a construction project and you can hear a jackhammer going. It makes it difficult for you to hear. From an acoustic perspective, which is where I go, it's just an unwanted signal because every sound is considered a signal. But anyways, different ways to think about it. So underwater noise specifically. So for one, sound travels in the air, how we hear it, much differently than it travels underwater. Underwater, sound travels 4.3 times faster. That means that if someone's really far away, I can hear them quicker underwater than if I was up in the air. So it means that underwater noise from all sorts of human activities can be heard from much, much farther away underwater, which means that all sorts of activities can have an impact on marine life underwater. Thinking about noise and how it impacts you, we were talking a little bit about I was just talking about how noise might be annoying when you're trying to listen to someone. But think about if you're going camping with your family or something like that, or you're in just a nice park in the city where you live, and you can hear the birds, you can hear the wind rustling through the trees, you can hear all these nice sounds of nature around you, and then an airplane flies overhead, and you get this loud noise, or maybe there's a construction project going on and there's an explosion. All of that human noise, anthropogenic noise as we call it, really can cause a disturbance. For us, when we're out in nature, it's more of an annoyance than anything. It doesn't really affect our life that much. But imagine that it's at your house. It's noise that's happening right outside your bedroom window when you're trying to sleep, and it makes it so you can't sleep. That causes some pretty big impacts on your life. Now think about this marine life, all these animals, and there is shipping activity going on 24 hours a day. Ships can be heard from tens of kilometers away, or there's a new construction project because they're building a new pier in the ocean, and all the animals, all the seals that live around there, they're all getting bombarded with noises constantly. So those are just some of the issues of noise. Underwater, there are kind of four main classes that we think about when we're talking about underwater noise. One is ship traffic, and I'm going to play sound from a ship that I've recorded on some of my instruments. This is a cruise ship. It's not super loud, but you can probably hear it coming through my speakers into your microphone.
Sure can.
All right. So it's just an annoying constantly, kind of like a roadway that's close by or an airplane going overhead. It's the same sort of idea. The main noise from ship traffic is caused by the propeller spinning around. When the propeller spins around, it creates bubbles, and those bubbles explode. It's called cavitation. And that's where the majority of noise from shipping comes from. They also have other things like their engine makes noise, and any sort of other activities or instruments that are being used on board can make noise as well. But the main noise is from the propeller. You wouldn't think that a spinning propeller would make so much noise, but it's quite incredible how much noise it actually makes. There's also construction activities. So pile driving is a big noise source. Pile driving is essentially taking these large posts and pounding them into the ground, kind of like a jackhammer, but you're actually putting this pole into the ground. There's also underwater explosions that happen for construction. Oil and gas activities are pretty big. When oil and gas companies are trying to figure out where oil is in the ocean, they use something called a seismic air gun. It essentially takes air and blasts it down to the bottom of the ocean, and it uses the sound wave to go down. It penetrates into the bottom of the ocean, and the signal bounces back up, and that tells them what's underwater, what's under the ocean floor. But it's incredibly loud. It's one of the loudest activities that can happen. Sonar is another big one. The military uses sonar. It's actually a sound wave to bounce a signal out and see what it bounces back off of. And they use that to detect enemy ships and different hazards in the water. But again, it's very loud. So all of these activities are very loud. Shipping is probably one of the biggest concerns because from 1960 to 2000, noise from ships in the ocean was doubling every decade. They recorded that off of the coast of California, and then it's been confirmed in some other areas since then. In the Arctic, shipping is currently at very low levels, but it's supposed to increase as sea ice becomes less and less and less in the Arctic. Ships will have greater access, so we can expect more and more noise from ships. How does noise actually impact animals? So this applies to all animals, but again, I'm really talking about marine animals or whales and seals specifically. So the first is masking, and that's the one that we think of most when we think of noise. Masking is you're talking to someone, you're trying to communicate, or you're doing something with noise, you're listening, and then this noise, this ship noise or an underwater explosion or something like that happens, and it makes it difficult for you to hear what you're trying to hear. So I'm going to play that ship noise again. And while I'm playing the ship noise, if I was speaking really quietly, it might become very hard for you to hear me with this in the background. And if it was a real ship that happened to be right beside me in my kitchen with me right now, it would be very hard for you to hear me. There's behavioral disturbance. So an animal hears that sound and it causes it to change what it's doing. So the animal might have been eating beforehand. I actually created a little video for this. It might be a killer whale. The killer whale is trying to eat fish. And killer whales use echolocation to eat fish. So they bounce off this high frequency signal, they figure out where the fish is in the water, and then they follow it. But then a ship comes by and the ship makes noise. That could cause the killer whale to leave the area, to get away from the noisy ship completely. It might just make it more difficult for them to find the fish because, again, they use sound to find fish. Or it might even make the fish leave completely. So again, behavioral disturbance is a pretty broad category. It could be they stop foraging, they change their behavior somehow, they leave an area. But it can have some pretty important long-term consequences. A whale that can't eat is a whale that's going to starve in the long run. So again, the more often it gets disrupted during foraging, the bigger the issue is going to be. Underwater noise can cause stress. Stress has some very important long-term consequences. Underwater noise can cause hearing damage. It could even cause animals to become deaf if the noise is loud enough. And finally, the biggest issue is death. It can actually kill animals. One common example is there's a type of whale called a beaked whale, and they show these really strong reactions to sonar noise from naval sonar, and it causes them to do some erratic diving behavior, and they get something called the bends. That's what happens with divers when they change their depth very quickly. They get a bunch of bad chemicals going through their blood, and it can actually cause them to die. So again, these are all the different types of impacts of noise on animals, going from the mildest, the masking, all the way down to the most severe, which is death. Okay, so that's underwater noise in general. Now let's go to the Arctic, which is kind of the crux of what I do and what I want to talk about today. So where is the Arctic? It's the very top of our world map here, above 66 degrees of latitude, if you want to think about it in terms of geography. In Canada, it's the northernmost parts of our territories of Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. It also includes parts of Alaska, most of Greenland, parts of Scandinavia, and a big chunk of Russia as well, and a very large piece of ocean called the Arctic Ocean. Us Arctic researchers like to look at the Arctic from the top of the world, so different perspective on the map. Looking down from the North Pole, we can see everything spread out, and it really kind of draws that central presence of the Arctic Ocean. The Arctic Ocean is a very large mass in the middle of the Arctic. It's defined by seasonal sea ice that covers the entire thing in the winter, and still very large chunks of it in the summertime. The presence of sea ice limits human activity. This photo that I'm showing here was, I was out on a plane ride last year, and this was just a photo in the Canadian Arctic, just showing all the sea ice. This is in the middle of August. Look at all that sea ice as far as the eye can see. When there's that much ice, you have to have a very special type of ship to go through called an icebreaker. But even icebreakers have trouble getting through that much ice. So standard ships like your container ships and your tankers and your private yachts and cruise ships, they can't get through that ice. So right now, the Arctic is protected by ice. But sea ice is melting. There's becoming less and less ice in the summertime. So this ice may not be a problem very far into the future, giving greater access to ships and other human activities. But right now, there isn't too much human activity, which means there's not much underwater noise, so it's quiet. Sea ice also makes it quite quiet because it means that wind and waves can't affect the water column as much, which is kind of the greatest natural source of noise in the ocean is wave sounds. So the Arctic is currently quiet. It's one of the quietest places in the world. That means that right now, different acoustic signals, different sounds, different noise sources can be heard from very far away because there isn't much background noise. The Arctic is home to some pretty cool marine mammals. It's home to bowhead whales. They're the only mysticete or baleen whale that only lives in the Arctic. Narwhal, the unicorn of the sea. They live in the eastern Canadian Arctic and a little bit in the European Arctic as well. Beluga whales are a very famous type of whale. They've been in a lot of aquaria, but they're also very, very Arctic whale. And then there are two species of seal that live exclusively in the Arctic, the bearded seal and the ring seal. And all of these animals use acoustics for various parts of their life. The seals and the bowhead whale, they use it just for communication for the most part. They use it as a mating call. They use it as just a hello, how are you sort of call. And I actually have their calls here. It's going to be a bit difficult for you to hear them, but I've got my volume at full. Here's what a bearded seal sounds like. This big, long whistle that it holds for minutes at a time sometimes. Ring seals, they're kind of like a dog in many ways for what we call their calls. They do barks and yelps. Oh, too far. Kind of. And then our bowhead whales, these are the ones that it's going to be most difficult for you to hear their call because it's very low frequency, which most speakers don't like very much. But we'll try it. Okay, and then our beluga whales and our narwhals, they both also use echolocation as well, which means they use it to navigate. They put out high frequency signals. They use to navigate through the water, and they also use it to find their food. And I don't have any recordings of narwhal, but I do have a bunch of beluga, and I'm going to share one with you right now. That high frequency whistle sound. Belugas are called the canaries of the sea because they make just an incredible diversity of different call types. Whistles and rasps and all sorts of interesting things. And we can spend hours just listening to them, but that's not the point of today's talk. The point is all of these animals rely on sound for various parts of their life, which means that underwater noise could potentially stop them from being able to hear these sounds and communicate with one another. The main sources of underwater noise in the Arctic are oil and gas activity. Down here on the bottom right is a drill ship that I saw in the Beaufort Sea about 10 years ago. And shipping activity. Shipping activity, like I said, is currently low, but it is supposed to, it has been increasing over the last 20 years, and it's supposed to continue increasing. So here's a Canadian Coast Guard ship that I saw off of Herschel Island also 10 years ago. So those are the main types of noise. I've already told you kind of what those noises sound like, but they can be pretty pervasive through the environment when they're there. So how do Arctic marine animals actually react to noise? This is a big review that we looked at over the last year or so. So kind of the big take home is that belugas and narwhals especially, they can be extremely sensitive to underwater noise. There was a study that showed that belugas and narwhals heard an icebreaker ship coming through from 50 kilometers away, and they reacted. The belugas completely left the area. They turned tail and swam away about another 50 kilometers. They're about 100 kilometers away from the ship, and they stayed away for 2 whole days before coming back. The narwhals do something different. They hear a noise, and they just stop. They freeze in the water. It's supposedly an anti-predator response, where if you stay still, maybe they won't see you. Eventually, once the ship got close, they also left the area. And showed that long delay in coming back. Bowhead whales, when they're foraging, when they're eating, they seem to ignore noises. But when they're migrating or just doing regular movement behavior, it causes them to change their movement behavior. They hear a ship or they hear oil and gas activity, and they leave the area. They also seem to change their diving behavior, where they change up their breathing cycle a bit. There's been very little work on seals and walrus, but they have shown some reaction to noise as well. So again, what is the future going to look like for these animals? Currently, there's an oil and gas moratorium in the North American Arctic, so that's in Alaska and in the Canadian Arctic. But there's plenty of people that are itching to get that over with so that they can start oil and gas activity. Other areas of the Arctic, especially the Norwegian Arctic and Russia, have a lot of oil and gas activity. And as I said, shipping is projected to increase. So all in all, even just with that increase in shipping, we can expect a lot more underwater noise in the Arctic. And if oil and gas activity increases, we can also, again, expect more noise in the Arctic. So the future is noisy for these animals. So what can we do for this? One big thing is investing in quieter technology. So right now I said that ships, the big noise is from their propellers. There's been a lot of work done looking at how you can make a quieter propeller. In fact, the Navy, that's their whole goal because they don't want to be heard from very far away. So the Navy actually already has some very quiet technology for propellers, but they're expensive. So you have to convince shipping companies that it's worth paying a bit more for a quieter propeller. Restricting human activities in important areas for marine mammals. So keeping the oil and gas activity away from some key areas for marine animals, like some of the marine protected areas that are out there, or some key foraging or calving areas for whales, making ships go around those areas as well. Reducing the speed of ships is also an important way to reduce noise because slower ships are generally quieter. Many of you, especially the classes that are in BC, may have heard about the slowdown trial between Vancouver and Victoria, where the Port of Vancouver, along with Transport Canada, they got ships to agree to slow down in certain areas that were important for southern resident killer whales around here. And they found that slower ships were quieter and it reduced underwater noise levels. So that shows in itself that this could be an effective way going forward, keeping slower ships to reduce underwater noise. So I haven't actually talked much about what I do. So I'm just going to end off with a couple of slides about what I actually do for my research and how this is kind of aimed towards underwater noise. So I work in the Western Canadian Arctic, that's specifically the Northwestern Territories and the Yukon. We've been putting out underwater microphones called hydrophones in the region since 2014. See all the green dots up on that map? That's where I currently have active hydrophones in the water that I need to go out and get this summer. The red dots are spots that I want to get to. So we've got sites that are near marine protected areas. We've got sites near some communities, and we really want to get into some more remote areas to listen to what's there. So what are we actually listening for? Well, first of all, we're listening for all the marine mammals that I showed you the calls for. We're trying to figure out when they're there, how often they're there in those regions. We're also listening for ships. So both when ships are there, but also trying to figure out how loud ships are and how much underwater noise they're adding to the environment. We can then compare when the marine mammals are there versus when the ships are there to figure out how much impact there is on those animals, how often they're getting exposed to underwater noise. The final thing that I do related to underwater noise is I do a lot of modeling. I use a lot of math, and we look at how we look at a satellite track of a ship, and then we can model how noise from that ship propagates out away from it. So we can figure out a noise footprint for that ship. In other words, we can see all the tracks from ships in a region, and we can try to estimate how much underwater noise is coming from those ships. And that's a really good tool for planning in the future, because we can look at different ways that we might move ships to try and get noise out of key areas, or key areas that we might want marine protected areas to keep ships out of, to protect marine animals. So just a couple of pictures to finish us off. Up on the top here, we've got the hydrophone up on the top right. That's the actual instrument that's used for collecting acoustic data. On the top left, that's me actually working with those hydrophones, loading them up with batteries and putting in new memory cards so they can stay underwater for a year at a time. On the bottom there's myself and my friend Matt Pine, who works with me. That's us out in our Zodiac last summer after we successfully got one of these things back. And that's on the bottom right is a picture of the actual hydrophone coming up from the bottom of the ocean after being down there for a year. You can see it's all covered up in kelp. And finally, we get to a lot of remote areas using these charter flights, these Twin Otter airplanes where we land on beaches in the remote Arctic, and then we put our Zodiac in the water and go out into the water. Anyways, that's the sort of fun things that I get to do in the summertime when there's less ice in the Arctic, and that's how I go out and collect my data. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I am happy to take any questions.
Super cool. Thank you so much, Dr. Halliday. All right, so we've got 3 classes live. I also want to do a shout out. We've got a grade 6 class, grade 6 students from Delhi Public School in Bangalore, India watching this. So they're going to be questions on YouTube, so we'll be looking forward to that. But let's start with Ms. Hearn Smith's class. If you guys want to kick us off with a question, come on up.
I'm trying to ask what sounds narwhals make. There you go.
Yeah, you're good.
What sounds do narwhals make?
So narwhals are very similar to belugas, actually. They make a lot of rasping calls, and they make a lot of whistles. They go, and they go, and a whole bunch of other ones that I probably can't do any justice to. But I can send around a link to Jesse at the end of this with both my website has all of the sort of calls that all the marine animals that I've been talking about make. And then I also know another resource that that has narwhal calls on it as well. So I'll send both of those around.
Super cool, and we'll certainly pass those along. I also want to make sure that you guys go back as classes and listen to the bearded seal again. We got a bit of it, but William, you were the first person ever to share that with me, and it's the most space alien creature you've ever heard. It's amazing.
It's pretty cool.
And you're very good at mimicking them, by the way. I appreciate it. All right, let's head to Miss Drake's class. If you guys have a question, come on up.
So I was wondering, what's your favorite thing to do on your job?
What's the favorite thing to do?
Yeah.
I would have to say it's getting out on the boat on the water in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. That is probably my favorite thing. There's the only people around are myself and the pilot that got us there. So it's just, we're just surrounded by hundreds of kilometers of nothing but wilderness. And we're surrounded by really cool marine animals and lots of cool animals on the shore and things that you just don't get to see very often. It's just a very serene place to be. And it's super cool, which is one reason that I really want to work on protecting the Arctic, because it is so unique and it's one of our last wilderness areas.
Very cool. Miss Oster's class, you guys are back in right now. I sent you the YouTube link as well. I know you're having some tech difficulties, so if you want to check in on the YouTube link and type in questions there, that'll work. But for now, if you want to try a question, we can see if it'll work with you guys. You'll just need to demute your own mic and maybe make your own video work and smack the computer. That might do it. Don't know if it's gonna do it, but anyway, I sent the link. You can always type in questions here too in the chat bar, so please do that, and we'll come back in just a second. I want to pass along the first question from the Bangalore class, which is, what marine animals make the loudest noises, Dr. Halliday?
The loudest, okay, probably the bowhead whales. The way loudness works is the bigger your body, the more sound you can project. So a bowhead whale can make, we look at sound in decibels. A bowhead whale can make a sound 160 to 180 decibels, which is incredibly loud. Compare that to a beluga whale that's between 120 and maybe 150 decibels, and the seals are quieter still than that.
So those are comparing to one another. I know what 160 decibels means sort of relatively. Can you give an example of something else that people might have experienced that would be at that level? But that's an incredibly loud sound.
It is. Well, and the other thing is that decibels underwater aren't measured the same way as decibels in air. So you knowing what 160 decibels are in air isn't actually the same thing. But compare that to a really loud ship underwater. Most ships are around 175 decibels, but a really loud ship could be as loud as 200 decibels. And that would be similar to you being in the engine room of the ship, essentially. Let's think about it that way. You right beside the engine when it's going full steam. Very loud, probably cause some hearing loss.
Very cool. All right, let's head back to Ms. Hearn-Smith's class. Come on up for a second.
Have you ever seen a narwhal, and how close have you gotten to one?
I have never seen a narwhal because I haven't been anywhere where they are. I haven't spent any time in the Eastern Canadian Arctic. I have been close to belugas. The closest I was my first time doing field work. I spent 10 weeks on Herschel Island, which you should look it up on a map. It's a little remote island in the very western part of the Canadian Arctic. And I was standing on the shore, and they were about 500 meters offshore, and I could kind of hear them whistling faintly from that far away.
You can hear whales? No. Sorry, you can hear the whales from when you're outside? That's very neat.
Well, so for one, they come up to breathe. And belugas are so chatty that they're whistling constantly. And even when their head's out of the water, they're still making a bit of noise.
Huh. How cool is that? Great answer. All right, Ms. Drake's class again.
How long have you been doing your work?
I think you said, how long have I been doing this project or this work?
Yeah, our job in general.
Since 2016 for this job. Before that, I was a student for 10 years.
And we covered this in the last hangout. What were you doing as a student, studying things that are quite different?
Yes, I was. During my undergraduate degree, I studied lake sturgeon and small mammals, lemmings in the Arctic, actually. In my master's, I studied small mammals in northwestern Ontario. And in my PhD, I studied snakes and beetles. So I've kind of been all over the place in terms of what I study.
And so at the end of your presentation, just as a follow-up question, and thank you for that, you showed the little plane. Now, how long does it take to get from Victoria to the Arctic, sort of in various flights? And is there boating? Is there hiking? Is there what's going on?
So I fly from Victoria, usually to Vancouver. That's just a 15-minute flight. And then from Vancouver to Whitehorse, that's a 2-hour flight. And then from Whitehorse to Inuvik, that's about a 4-hour flight. And then from Inuvik, we hop on that little plane and fly 2 to 3 hours to the nearest community, Ulahuktuk. And then we fly at least an hour to our remote site where we put our boat in the water. So it's very far.
Okay. That's dedication. All right, guys, let's go back to Ms. Hearn-Smith's class. You guys have a third one. Come on up. Yeah.
What months do you go out in the boat?
What months?
Yeah.
August, usually. So the areas that I go, the sea ice starts to melt in, let's say June. By July, most of the ice is gone, but by August, there's a small enough amount of ice that I can actually get out and still navigate my boat. I do have some photos where I'm still surrounded by chunks of ice in my little boat. September is the best month to go out in terms of low ice, but it also starts to get stormy, so my little boat wouldn't handle the weather that way. So August is my key month.
As if to add another difficulty to the challenge of doing this work.
Yeah.
All right, so this is a question that might not actually apply to you, but I'm going to ask it again from the Bangalore class. So I don't know if you actually dive down specifically yourself, but the question was, if you're diving, can you hear many chatty marine animals? Does it impact your health in any way? Can you concentrate? Like, does that, if in case you dive, and if you know other researchers that do dive, is that distracting?
I don't personally dive. I do know some people who have dove in the Arctic, but these animals aren't loud enough to cause any sort of hearing damage that way. Just to directly answer that question, I imagine there will be many other distracting things about having a marine mammal around you other than just the noise that they're making, though. So.
Turn around, surprise, there's a whale.
Yeah.
All right, let's go back to Miss Drake's class.
If like the Northwest Passage is gonna be like quadrupled by 2025, what is it now, and how much would it be in 2025?
All right, good job knowing what the Northwest Passage is, first of all. So where I study is at the western entrance to the Northwest Passage, just for everyone. So right now, the area where I'm studying, there's about up to 20 ships in that area in an entire shipping season. So that's right now. That's a figure from a couple of years ago, actually. But 10 times bigger is the number that I've heard for 2020. So that's 200 ships maybe. So 2025, I've never actually heard the quadrupled by 2025. But if that were the case, then we'd be talking about 40 to 80 ships, somewhere in that range. I would imagine. Which still is nothing over 2 months compared to some other places that have that many ships in a week or less.
But still unusual and a big change for the ecosystem and the people that are there too.
Exactly. The animals are used to almost nothing around them, so having that many more, it could be a very big impact.
Yeah. Speaking of hearing these animals, I want to go back to the hydrophones, and just for the class's perspective, how much does one of those hydrophones cost?
Ours aren't actually that bad. Once you're going to add all the bells and whistles onto it, we're talking $10,000 Canadian.
Okay.
There are some other ones that are much better than the ones that we use that are $20,000-$30,000.
Okay. And that's paid for by universities, from research agencies. How does that sort of research happen? So
our organization, our big funder is the Weston Foundation. So that's the family that owns Loblaws, the grocery store in Canada. They're a big fan of Arctic research in general. So they actually put a lot of money towards Arctic research. So that's one of our big funders. We get a bit of money from the government from some targeted things. We get a bit of money from other NGOs like WWF, World Wildlife Fund. Those are our main sources, really.
Excellent. There you go. Thank you so much. This is a question that we got quite a bit in the last one, so I wanted to cover it. All right, guys, let's do a couple more questions here. Ms. Hearn-Smith's class. Let's do one last one from your class. Come on up.
Are belugas, narwhals, and bowhead whales the only whales in the Arctic?
Good question. So they're not the only whales. They're the ones who live there year-round in some capacity. Other whales do come up from the south. So there's killer whales occasionally in my area. We get them a couple times a decade. There aren't very many. In the eastern Canadian Arctic, killer whales are now there every summer. They come up for the summer, but they try to stay out of the icy areas and they get pushed out by the ice. There are gray whales that have been going into the Chukchi Sea in Alaska for a long time. And then there's a whole bunch of new species that are coming up. There's fin whales and humpback whales and minke whales and harbor porpoises. And there's a very long list of animals that are now starting to use the Arctic as it becomes more ice-free in the summertime. But all of those animals are kicked out in the summertime because they can't handle sea ice.
Okay. So out of curiosity, I know this isn't your main area of expertise, but it's something that's very, very interesting is that these new whales are coming in. You may know, as they're already being seen effects on the current populations of the whales that have been there and can last there all year long?
The only impact that I'm aware of is killer whales. The killer whales that are coming up are mammal eaters, so they eat other whales. So the narwhal, bowhead, and beluga whales in the eastern Canadian Arctic all react to killer whales and are all driven out of areas when killer whales come in. And the killer whales are eating them, so their populations are obviously getting affected by it in one way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Dire but interesting message.
It's something that we are trying to track in our area. It's not as big of an issue because we're very far from the direct access to the southern oceans.
Yeah.
The nearest southern ocean to us is the Pacific, and it's a very long way to get from the Pacific to the Western Canadian Arctic. So any killer whales that have been there have to work really hard to get there.
Excellent. And then we'll take one last question from Ms. Drake's class. If you guys want to wrap us off.
What?
Fight for it. Yeah, no.
What? What do you do in all the other months?
Excellent question. So when I have a successful field season, I pull the hydrophone out of the water that has a year worth of data on it. To give you an example, we have, how many hydrophones do we have in the water right now? Close to 10 hydrophones in the water, with all of them each with a year worth of recordings on them. So I spend the rest of the year working through those data, analyzing them for what animals are there, for what ships are there, for how loud it is. Those are all 3 different analyses. And then actually making sense of it, writing it up into a report and that sort of thing. So lots of time on the computer really is what I do for the rest of the year.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. I want to dive in, actually, before we wrap up, Dr. Halliday, how can people learn more about the work that's going on in the Arctic, your work specifically? You mentioned a website of yours. If you want to share what that is, again, I can pass that to classes, but where can kids learn more about what we're doing in Canada's Arctic?
All right. So first of all, the work that we're doing, we have a dedicated website to it called www.arcticnoise.ca. It's got kind of a synopsis of our current research, a list of the publications that we've done, so the reports on all of the studies that we've done, and then it's got that big library of marine animal sounds in it as well. There are a couple of atlases. One I shared with you last time, Jesse, was put together by Oceans North and WWF and a couple other NGOs. It's the Marine Atlas to Arctic Canada. That one's a really good one for that sort of thing. And actually, that one is just generally a good resource, I think, for all of these issues. So it talks to you about what animals live in the Arctic. It tells you generally about the different ecosystems. It talks to you about the people who live in the Arctic, which is a very key component of working in the Arctic. And it also tells you about what's happening in terms of industry and that sort of thing, and kind of future impacts.
Outstanding. So we'll pass along all those to classes. I'll get those in an email to you at the end. And then, William, if you could pass along the animal sounds too, that would be great. Oh, they're on your website. So I'll pass along everything. It'll be great.
Yeah, I think I emailed them all to you after our last presentation, but I'll verify that.
Perfect. Okay. And I did lie. I want to ask one more question, which is, again, from the class in Bangalore, which is, what's the most mysterious or strangest sound you've ever heard? Is it an animal? Is it a ship? What's going on?
We have a strange sound in our recorder at Ulahaktuk. So the Ulahaktuk is the westernmost community on Victoria Island. And there's a strange knocking sound that happens. It goes, and it happened throughout an entire year of recordings. We later found out that there was a walrus there. So walrus use this knocking sound. And we think it's the walrus, but it's a little bit different. So it's either the walrus or it's something odd in the water that's just knocking. That's not super strange, but it's rare to have a walrus in that area. So if it is a walrus, it's pretty cool.
Very cool. Well, thank you for that. We had a session the other day where there was this complete mystery sound that no one's known for years, and they sent it to scientists all around the world, so it's very exciting. All right, Dr. Halliday, what we do at the end of every hangout, I'm going to demute the class's microphone. So Ms. Hearn-Smith's class, Ms. Drake's class, if you guys could just join me in saying a huge thank you to Dr. Halliday for joining us today. There's noise for you.
Yes, it was.
Thank you so much for joining us, guys. If you guys want to join us for other Oceans Week hangouts, we wrap up tomorrow, so please do come back. Dr. Halliday, thank you so much again, and have a wonderful day.